Over the years, many people have had questions regarding the topic of oaths and vows and whether or not they needed to honor the ones that they have made, sometimes prior to conversion. Some have viewed a vow as a little more important than a single or very simple and single promise that's made to someone. Others have perceived a vow as being so binding that to break a vow would be tantamount to committing the unpardonable sin. There's no way one could be forgiven. Still others sense the commitment to a vow somewhere between the two extremes. Rather than address what human reasoning concludes regarding this topic about vows, the correct course is to turn to the Word of God and see exactly what does God say on this subject of oaths and vows and our need to be committed to the fulfillment. First of all, we need to know exactly what is meant by the term vow. Since some confuse making vows with making oaths and swearing, we need to begin this topic by examining, first of all, the meaning of the word oath. What does the Bible mean when it uses the term oath or oaths? The Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, under the heading of oath, says that oath is from the Hebrew word shabbat. It means to bind oneself by an oath, to give one's sacred, unbreakable word in testimony that the one swearing would faithfully perform some promised deed, or that he would faithfully refrain from some evil act. Closely related to the word Shabbat is Shabuah, and it means a solemn verbal statement or pledge that is affirmed. The Vine's Expository Dictionary of the New Testament has under oath the Hebrew or the Greek word horkos. Horkos, H-O-R-K-O-S. It says horkos is primarily equivalent to herkos, which means a fence, an enclosure, that which restrains a person. The confirmation of a compact among men, guaranteeing the discharge of liabilities. So that's oath from the New Testament. Also in the New Testament, the Louan-Nida Greek English lexicon of the New Testament has under horkos, to affirm the truth of a statement by calling on a divine being to execute sanctions against a person if the statement in question is not true. It goes on to say, in the case of a deity taking an oath, his divine being is regarded as validating the statement. It goes on, horkos also means to swear, to make an oath, an oath. In a number of languages, it is necessary to be quite specific in referring to the swearing of an oath. For example, to say something by calling upon God to listen, or to state that something is true and asking God to punish if it is not true, or to make God responsible for what one has said. So we find that the primary meaning of the word or the focus of an oath was to confirm a promise between two different parties. An oath was a verbal pronouncement which exhibited one's total commitment to completing his promise to the other party. So that was the word, that's what oath means. There are numerous examples of the use of oaths in the Old Testament, even some in the New. Let's go back, first of all, to Genesis chapter 24 and take note of an oath that God made, or I should say that God shows us or records for us that happened between Abraham and Abraham's servant. Genesis 24, beginning in verse 1, Now Abraham was old, well advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. So Abraham said to the oldest servant of his house, who ruled over all that he had. Please put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord. So notice he's to take an oath using the name of God. By the Lord, it says, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but you shall go to my country, that is back to Ur of the Chaldees, back to Mesopotamia, to my family, and take a wife for my son Isaac. And the servant said to him, perhaps the woman will not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I take your son back to the land from which you came? But Abraham said to him, beware that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my family, and who spoke to me and swore to me, saying, to your descendants I give this land, he will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. I'm trusting God. God is the one that is behind this, so I'm trusting that God will do what he says. He'll provide. But he goes on in verse 8 to say, and if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be released from this oath. So this is a conditional oath. Only do not take my son back there. This example shows that there are circumstances beyond a mortal's control which prevents the fulfillment or can prevent the fulfillment of an oath. And so we need to keep that in mind when we think about making an oath ourselves. All right, another example is found over in Joshua chapter 2. And this was where the two spies had been protected by Rahab, and then they are in the process of getting ready to leave Jericho with Rahab's help. And so we read here beginning in verse 12. Rahab states, now therefore I beg you, she tells the two spies, swear to me by the Lord. In other words, she wants them to make an oath. So swear to me by the Lord. Now, if you look back up in verse 10, she understands the Lord as being the divine being who brought the children of Israel out of Egypt by holding back the Red Sea. She knows, that information had been disseminated throughout that whole region of what had happened in Egypt. And so she says, the Lord, the one who opened the way through the Red Sea, she says, dried up. That means open a way through the Red Sea. So swear to me by the Lord, this great divine being, since I have shown you kindness, that you also will show kindness to my father's house, and give me a true token, and spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. So the men answered her, our lives for yours, if none of you tell this business of ours. And it shall be, when the Lord has given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with you. So in verse 15, the New International translates, so she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. Now she had said to them, go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there for 3 days until they return, and then go on your way. The men said to her, this oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless, notice this is conditional, unless when we enter the land you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers, and all your family into your house. If anyone goes outside your house into the street, his blood will be on his own head. We will not be responsible. As for anyone who is in the house with you, his blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on him. Verse 20 from the Tanakh, and if you disclose this mission of ours, we shall likewise be released from the oath which you made us take. So if she said anything, if any of this information got out that they were there and what was coming, then once again, this was conditional. The vow would not be binding. Verse 21, the New International translates, "Agreed," she replied, "let it be as you say." So she sent them away, and they departed. And she tied the scarlet cord in the window. So this example shows that diligence must be taken by both parties to perform their respective roles in a promise or a contract. Otherwise, the oath would be non-binding. It would be nullified. All right, another example is the example between God and Abraham. Back in Hebrews chapter 6. Let's go to the New Testament here. Hebrews chapter 6. And beginning in verse 13. And here Paul writes, "For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater," because God is the supreme being, he swore by himself. Paul refers here to God's oath that made his promise to Abraham unconditional. God had already told Abraham, "I'm going to make you father of many nations," etc., etc., etc. But it was all conditional. Now, because of what had happened, and let's go back to Genesis chapter 22 and see. In Genesis chapter 22, this is where Abraham took Isaac up to Mount Moriah. And it was at Mount Moriah that God said, "I want you to sacrifice your son." And so here, Abraham, by the time we come down to verse 15, Abraham has exhibited his willingness to offer his son Isaac in sacrifice to God, according to what God told him to do. He's willing to do it. And so as a result, here in verse 15, "Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven." First time was, "Stop, don't plunge the knife into Isaac." This time he said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing, because you have been willing to sacrifice what was most important to you. I will make the promise unconditional." So God swore an oath, but since there's no one any more powerful or supreme than God, God said, "By myself." Now, going back to Hebrews chapter 6, Paul goes on to elaborate on this thing of taking oaths and why men want oaths. Hebrews 6, again, 13, "When God made a promise to Abraham because he could swear, but no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, 'Surely, blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you.' And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. For men indeed swear by the greater." Notice, they swear by the greater, something greater than themselves. "And an oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute." Now, verse 17, the New International translates, "Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised." That is, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. "He confirmed it with an oath." God did this so that by two unchangeable or unalterable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope offered to us may be greatly encouraged. Paul points out that God spoke two things which bound him to the covenant that he made with Abraham: a promise and an oath. Two things. Since God is immortal, since God is supreme, nothing can interfere with him fulfilling his part of the covenant that was made. Abraham agreed to do what Abraham needed to do. But God now made it absolutely ironclad. Nothing can change this. Nothing can change my promise because I have sworn an oath. Now, the difference between the immortal God who made this oath and mortal man is the main foundation upon which the Apostle James builds when he addresses the approach that a Christian should take towards swearing and using oaths here in James chapter 4. James chapter 4, let's go to verse 13. And I'll read from the New International Version. Now listen, James writes, now listen, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go do this or that. We'll go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. You say you're going to do all of these things? Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. That's what mortal human beings are. We're only here for a very brief time. James compares the human life, the lifespan that we have, to a mist in the air, and pretty soon it's gone. You get up and there's fog. It doesn't take long before the fog burns off. Like flowers in a field. They bloom, but then they die and they're gone. So mortality is is something of a very short duration, and so you're just a mist that appears and vanishes. Instead, verse 15, instead of saying, we're going to do this, we're going to go here, we're going to do this, and over a year later, well, hold on, how do you know you'll still be here later? How do you know you'll still be drawing breath a year later? Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast and brag. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. And so very clearly, God tells us through what James records here that mortal man can't really make an oath and guarantee that it will be upheld. Because his lights could go out in the next second, the next minute, before the end of the day. He is not like God, who is immortal, God who has always been and always will be, the eternal. Also here in James chapter 5, down in verse 12. James 5:12, I'll read from the Complete Jewish Bible. Here James writes, above all, brothers, stop swearing oaths. Not, in other words, don't use the term by heaven, not by earth, don't use that term, and not by any other formula. Rather, as one who is a disciple of Jesus Christ, who has God dwelling in you, let your yes be simply yes, and your no simply no, so that you won't fall under condemnation. Failure to perform an oath is a transgression of the 9th commandment. We're not to bear false witness. And if God's name is used, it's also a transgression of the 3rd commandment. Don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And so, we make an oath and say, by heaven, I'm going to do this. That means, God's going to make sure it gets done. You're going to be there to do it. No guarantees. You don't use that terminology. Oaths which men swear are generally done due to rashness based on pride. Now, a good example of this is found in the account in Matthew chapter 14 of Herod and the beheading of John the Baptist. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 14 and verse 3. It says, for Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had said to him, it is not lawful for you to have her. John said, look, there is no reason for you to be able to take his wife. And although he wanted to put him to death, that is, Herod wanted to put John to death because of what he had said. He was angry with him because he said, no, you don't have the power. You don't have the right to do this. So who are you to say that? I'm Herod. I'm the most powerful man in this province. Although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him, that is John the Baptist, as prophet. But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore, he promised with an oath, please note, he swore. He promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. So she, having been prompted by her mother, said, give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter. And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, note, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, pride, he commanded it to be given to her. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison. Herod made a stupid oath, and due to his pride, he was willing to go against his conscience, go against what he knew was going to create repercussions from the people, and perform that oath even though it required the death of an innocent man. A man who had only told him basically the truth. He was not legally, in God's eyes, able to take this woman that he had taken as a wife. Now, another aspect that all too often enters into making oaths is vengeance based on hatred. A good example would be the conspiracy that was brought together against the Apostle Paul at Jerusalem. Over in Acts chapter 23, Acts chapter 23, and in verse 12, Acts 23, verse 12, and when it was day, some of the Jews banded together and, note, bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Now there were more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy. They came to the chief priests and elders and said, we have bound ourselves under a great oath, that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul. Now you, therefore, together with the council, suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him. But we are ready to kill him before he comes near. Now, of course, we know the story. Paul was able to escape. They did not kill him. Paul lived for years later. We must assume that all 40-plus men died within a matter of a few weeks. Probably not. They probably went against their oath. They probably went ahead and ate and drank. Unlikely that they followed through with that oath. But again, what was the reason for it? Hatred. They were out for vengeance. And people generally will make an oath when it is driven by emotion. And yet, just as we saw in James chapter 5, we're not supposed to make any oath. Now that we have the essential background on oaths and swearing, let's next see what the term vow means. The word vow in the English from Webster's Dictionary is simply a solemn promise, especially one made to God or to some deity, an act by which one consecrates or devotes himself to some act, service, or condition. An oath or a vow is also a promise of fidelity or constancy, as the marriage vow. And vow also means, from Webster's, a solemn assertion. Nelson's Expository Dictionary of the Old Testament tells us the term in the Old Testament, the Hebrew that's used there, means this: The vow has two basic forms, the unconditional and the conditional. The unconditional is an oath where someone binds himself without expecting anything in return. The obligation is binding upon the person who has made the vow. The word spoken has the force of an oath, which generally could not be broken. The conditional vow generally had a preceding clause before the oath, giving the conditions which had to come to pass before the vow became valid. And then the Low and Nita Greek English lexicon of the New Testament, the Greek word that's used for vow is eucha, and it means a promise to God that one will do something, with the implication that failure to act accordingly will result in divine sanctions against the person in question. Clearly, there is a difference between an oath and a vow. An oath is the confirmation of a promised action, usually offered due to pressure for reassurance from the one who is the recipient of the promise. Well, I want more than just you telling me you're going to do this. I need to hear some affirmation, so give me a vow. Vow to me. Like that's going to make a big difference with people, all the time. Do you swear to tell the truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth? Well, the lawyers don't even know how to tell the truth. Why in the world would some guy on a witness stand be willing to tell the truth? They make a mockery out of it. Simply put, a vow is a promise to God or to another person. Can be to another person, such as marriage. It's always voluntary. The vow is always voluntary, never because of twisting of an arm. It's made by one's own free will and never coerced. If one vows and isn't able to come through and deliver on that vow, it becomes a sin because the ninth commandment is broken. And again, if God's name is used in that vow, then also the third commandment. So it is a sin if the vow is not fulfilled. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, we have some instruction that God gave to Israel regarding vows. Deuteronomy 23, verse 21. It says, when you make a vow to the Lord, your God, you shall not delay to pay it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you. And it would be sin to you, that it's sin not to pay that vow. So once the vow is made, it must be paid. A promise to God entails using His name, as Deuteronomy chapter 5. As a reminder here, as Moses goes back and reiterates the commandments that were given by God at Mount Sinai, recorded in Exodus chapter 20, here he's reiterating it in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, verse 11, where it says, you shall not take the name or lift up, which the Hebrew means, you shall not lift up the name of the Lord your God in vain. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes His name in vain. And so to make a vow to God, to use God's name, places us in jeopardy of transgressing the third commandment. In Numbers chapter 30, Numbers 30 and verse 2, if a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by some agreement, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Now, we have a very good example of this in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 1. Here we have the story, 1 Samuel chapter 1, the story of Hannah. Hannah was the mother of Samuel. And her example is an excellent one of one who honored her promise to God and did according to all that she told God she would do, regardless of how painful, how difficult it was for her to follow through. Here in verse 11 of 1 Samuel chapter 1, then she made a vow. Remember, Hannah had been barren. She was not able to have children, and so she made a vow. And she said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. So, she made a vow, it says here. She made a vow to God. You give me a son, and I will give him to you. She wanted the experience of having a child. Down in verse 27, here she has brought the child in order to give him to Eli and the priests. Anyway, she says in verse 27, for this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition, which I asked of him, which she vowed she would do something. Therefore I also have lent him to the Lord, as I have vowed. Doesn't say that, but that's what she did. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord. So they worship the Lord there. She surrendered her only child, the only child she'd ever had, to God's service. But because she kept her vow, God was very merciful, and he later gave her 3 more sons and 2 daughters, because she did what she said she would do. So here's an example, and again, it was very difficult, not easy to follow through and do what one has vowed, but she did, and she was blessed. Making a vow to God is a very serious action. It is not to be done lightly. Notice in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 2. Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven and you on earth, therefore let your words be few. Let's skip verse 3, go to verse 4. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. It is better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? Now, an example of this situation, of being hastily saying something, not thinking it through, and not following through with what you say, is found back here in Acts chapter 5 of the New Testament. It doesn't say directly that there was a vow, but I believe there probably was. Definitely a lie was told. But notice how God followed through with what Ecclesiastes chapter 5 says. In Acts chapter 5, verse 1, but a certain man named Ananias, with Sapphira his wife, sold a possession, and he kept back part of the proceeds, his wife also being aware of it, and brought a certain part and laid it at the apostles' feet. Now, obviously, they had made the statement that they had sold, and this was all that they had received from the sale of this property. Otherwise, Peter wouldn't have said what he goes on to say in verse 3. But Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and keep back part of the price of the land for yourself? While it remained, was it not your own? And after it was sold, was it not in your own control? Why have you conceived this thing in your heart? You have not lied to men, but to God. So, God was brought into this. There must have been a vow for God to be brought into this. You have lied to God. Then Ananias, hearing these words, fell down and breathed his last. So great fear came upon all those who heard these things. And the young men arose, wrapped him up, carried him out, and buried him. Now it was about 3 hours later when his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. And Peter answered her, "Tell me, whether you sold the land for so much." She said, "Yes, for so much." Then Peter said to her, "How is it that you have agreed together to test the Spirit of the Lord? Look, the feet of those who have buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out." Then immediately she fell down at his feet and breathed her last. And the young men came in and found her dead, and carrying her out, buried her by her husband. So great fear came upon all the church and upon all who heard these things. God was lied to. A vow was made. A vow, again, is a promise made to God. This vow was made to God in the presence of members of God's church, so that Peter and others were witnesses to the vow that this man and woman, this husband and wife, had made. This event occurred in part to show the church that God expects all who claim to be converted to honor their vows of baptism and marriage. If we're converted, we've got to honor those vows. We have no other option. Ananias and Sapphira, they have no other option. They either followed through and did what they said they were doing, or else they paid the price. It was physical death. Now, as we've already reviewed in the example of Herod and the decapitation of John the Baptist, a human proclivity is to be rash in making oaths and vows to other men. The same tendency exists in the making of vows to God, as we observe back here in Judges chapter 11, in the example of Jephthah and his daughter. Judges chapter 11, and beginning in verse 30. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. Okay, so not to another human being, but to God. And said, if you, God, will indeed deliver the people of Ammon into my hands, then it will be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the people of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. Verse 32, the New International translates, Then Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. He devastated 20 towns from Aurora to the vicinity of Minnith as far as Abel-Keramim. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. When Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of tambourines? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh, my daughter, you have made me miserable and wretched because I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." "My father," she replied, "you've given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request," she said. "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." "You may go," he said, and he let her go for 2 months. She and the girls went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. Verse 39, And it was so at the end of 2 months that she returned to her father. He carried out his vow with her, which he had vowed. She knew no man. And it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went 4 days each year to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. Now, in verse 31, the King James Version has a marginal rendering, which frankly is probably correct, where it states in verse 31, whatever whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return from the people of Ammon shall surely be the Lord's, or I will offer it up for a burnt offering. There's the little word or there, which most of the translations leave out. If we combine that alternate translation from the King James margin with verses 39 and 40 here, the indication leans much more to Jephthah's daughter honoring her vow by devoting herself to God. That is, she would remain celibate the rest of her life. She would never marry. Had Jephthah offered her as a literal sacrifice, he would have disobeyed God's instruction not to murder or cause a child to pass through the fire. If the vow included the murder of his daughter, then God would never have considered it a binding vow. Now, the main lesson from this example is that we must be exceedingly careful not to make rash promises or vows because of the hurt and the sorrow that we can bring on others by not thinking before speaking. Don't be hasty. We saw that with our mouth back in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Now, another point that needs to be considered in respect to the account of Jephthah, is there a difference between rash statements or reckless promises and a binding vow? Is there a difference? Since God is ultimately the one who binds the promises that are made to him, we must examine the question, what does God classify as a binding vow? What does God say? Not what we concoct or conclude, but what does God's Word show us concerning what is a binding vow? Well, God's Word reveals a number of qualifications that must be met before God considers one bound to the vow that he makes. First of all, let's turn back to Luke chapter 14. Okay, first qualification, the vow must be made with a sound, rational mind. The vow must be made with a sound, rational mind. Now, here in Luke chapter 14, Jesus Christ makes the statement, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, now that is, come to me in order to become a disciple, to become a follower, which requires the presence of Christ in us. He's talking here about the prerequisites to baptism. Whoever comes to me and does not hate, which again we know the Greek word missio means to love less by comparison. Hate or love to a lesser degree his father and mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, and his own life also. He cannot be my disciple. I will not accept him if this criteria is not met. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me. Whoever does not bear his cross. Again, bearing the cross, go back to Luke chapter 9, it's very clear there. Once a cross is taken up, once the stake is taken up by the one who is sentenced to death, then you must go to wherever that stake is going to be erected and put to death. In other words, this is something you start, you cannot turn back. Whoever takes up his cross, takes up his stake. So this is for life. God must be absolutely number one. This is for life is number two. And follow and come after me, or follow after me. That means live by the example and the instruction of Jesus Christ. Cannot be my disciple. So, there are certain criteria that must be met before God will honor one who comes to Christ. For which of you intending to build a tower does not sit down first and count the cost whether he has enough to finish it, lest after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king going to make war against another king does not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000. Or else, while the other is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks conditions of peace. So likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. Jesus instructs us to carefully count the cost before we enter into the vow that is sealed by baptism. He says, you got to count the cost. In fact, since God will not grant His Spirit to one who has not repented, the vow of one who is unrepentant will not be bound. We can make a vow, I'm going to do, but if we're not repentant, the vow doesn't take. God's not going to honor it. By giving these instructions, Jesus emphasizes the need for rational thinking and sound judgment before making any promise to God. All right, second qualification of a binding vow, the vow must be bridled by maturity. The vow must be bridled by maturity. Back in Numbers chapter 30 again. Numbers 30, chapter that deals primarily, almost totally, I guess, with vows. Numbers 30, verse 3 says, if a woman vows a vow to the Lord and binds herself by some agreement while in her father's house in her youth, she's a young woman, and her father hears her vow and the agreement by which she has bound herself, and her father holds his peace, then all her vows shall stand, and every agreement with which she has bound herself shall stand. But if her father overrules her on the day that he hears, then none of her vows nor her agreements by which she has bound herself shall stand. And the Lord will forgive her because her father overruled her. In this case, the maturity of the woman's father bridled an immature vow. No statement is made regarding the vows of a son. Other scriptures, such as Numbers chapter 14, show that the age of accountability was considered 20 years for a man. After that, he was liable. But with women, it was different. A woman under her father's care than a woman under her husband's care. And so, again, while in the father's house, the father had the ability to overrule a vow. Third qualification of a binding vow. The one who vows must be capable of performing the vow. The one who vows must be capable of performing the vow. Now, one allowance that God made for unconverted Israel was the dissolution of the marriage vow and remarriage of those who were divorced. Notice in Deuteronomy chapter 24. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, King James translation, when a man has taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. So here is an allowance for divorce and remarriage. This topic was being discussed during the time that Jesus Christ was in the flesh on the earth and was brought to his attention in Matthew chapter 19. So let's turn back to Matthew chapter 19, and we'll begin here in verse 3. Matthew 19:3. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" Now, they were going back to what we just read in Deuteronomy chapter 24. If he's found some uncleanness, well, does that mean any reason? He, Jesus, answered and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." The male and the female will be one flesh, not the male and the male, the female and the female. God is very specific here about marriage. So then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, because God is the one who created the institution of marriage. So, He created the institution. Those who come together in that institution, God is considering them to be bound. What God has joined together, let not man separate. They said to him, these Pharisees, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away," or divorce her? Because that's what it says in Deuteronomy 24. Well, they wouldn't have said that. They would have said in Deuteronomy or in the Torah. Moses said. It wasn't divided up in 24 chapters at that point. He said to them, Moses, note, "because of the hardness of your hearts," because of your unconversion, "permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, the way God instituted marriage, it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for porneia," sexual immorality, it's translated in the New King James, "except for porneia or sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." His disciples said to him, "Well, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it's better not to marry, better not get into that situation." But he, Jesus, said to them, "All cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb. There are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it." And so Jesus makes it very clear. God allowed unconverted Israel to divorce and remarry. And again, this qualification of the vow is the one who vows must be capable of performing it. They were not capable, some of them, of performing that marital vow, except for discovering a perverted mind. We go back to porneia, and it's basically talking about a perverted mind. By that, you find the term porneia will refer to incest. It will refer to homosexuality. It will refer to incessant adulteries or whoremongering. God says, if the party that is in that marriage is doing those things, then you have a reason for it, except for porneia. So Jesus gives the exception. In Romans chapter 7, notice, Romans 7. The marriage vow is binding on the converted until death. Romans 7, verse 1. "Or do you not know, brethren? For I speak to those who know the law." That is, Paul says, I am speaking to those who have a converted mind, that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives. For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she is released from the law of her husband. So then, if, while her husband lives, she marries another man, she will be called an adulteress. That is, to those who know the law, the converted. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, although she has married another man. Now, by this teaching, Jesus shows that God expects those who are capable of keeping their vows to do so, yet He releases those who aren't capable. Now, binding vow, qualification number 4. The vow must be understood to involve only the one who vows and God, or, in the case of marriage, the man and the woman and God. Because God figures into the marriage, because God is the one who created the institution of marriage. Man didn't come up with it. God designed it. God made it that way. The vow may also include those who are consenting to the vow, such as Jephthah's daughter. But it excludes any who don't consent to the vow. Once again, God makes this understanding, or reveals this understanding, in the statutes in the book of Numbers, chapter 30. Numbers chapter 30. And verse 6. But if indeed, still continuing on where we left off with the woman who was under her father's care, or still in her father's house, made a vow, and is either rescinded or allowed to stay. But if indeed she takes a husband, so here she leaves her father and she marries a man, takes a husband, while bound by her vows. All right, well, her husband now, she's now married, she's left her father's house, her father did not object to the vow, so, fine. She was bound by that vow, but now there's a different situation because now she is associated with a different individual. She's no longer under her father's jurisdiction. She is now a partner in a marriage relationship. If she takes a husband while bound by her vows or by a rash utterance from her lips, by which she bound herself, and her husband hears it and makes no response to her on the day that he hears, then her vows shall stand, and her agreements by which she has bound herself shall stand. But, verse 8, if her husband overrules her on the day that he hears it, he shall make void her vow which she vowed and what she uttered with her lips, by which she bound herself, and the Lord will release her. Now, since a husband and a wife were considered to be one flesh, one, and a vow made by the wife would affect the husband, he had the right to rescind the vow once it came to his attention. If he had knowledge of it and said nothing, then he was considered to agree to the conditions. Who knows what kind of vow she may have made. Maybe she vowed she would always wear her hair in a mohawk. I don't know. But the husband says, there is no way I'm living under the same roof with this. Or she made some vow, I'm going to always wear these same socks to bed every night. Oh no, that's not going to work either. I don't know what all would be entailed, but, the husband, because he is now part of this relationship, he had the right to rescind it, to say, nope, that vow is no good. Goes on. Verse 9. Also, any vow of a widow or a divorced woman by which she has bound herself shall stand against her. Now, since a widow or a divorcee wasn't bound to another in a marriage contract, she was the only one affected by the vow and was considered bound, because no one else would be affected by her vow but her. Verse 10 Goes on. If she vowed in her husband's house, or bound herself by an agreement with an oath, and her husband heard it, and made no response to her, and did not overrule her, then all her vows shall stand, and every agreement by which she bound herself shall stand. But if her husband truly made them void on the day he heard them, then whatever proceeded from her lips concerning her vows, or concerning the agreement binding her, it shall not stand. Her husband has made them void, and the Lord will forgive her. Every vow and every binding oath to afflict her soul, her husband may confirm it, or her husband may make it void. Now, if her husband makes no response whatever to her from day to day, then he confirms all her vows or all the agreements that bind her. He confirms them because he made no response to her on the day that he heard them. So if the widow or divorcee remarries, from verse 9, her new husband has the right to rescind a vow that would affect him. She was stuck with the vow, but once she remarried, then all of a sudden, now this husband has the right to rescind the vow that she had made. Verse 15 from the Tanakh translation, but if he annuls them after the day he finds out, he shall bear her guilt. So if after hearing the vow and doing nothing, he then attempts later on to rescind the vow, he's considered guilty himself of breaking the vow because he's agreed to come under the terms of the vow by his silence, because he didn't say anything. God will not bind a vow which involves anyone else who is in ignorance of that vow. For instance, God would not bind the vow of a woman who vows to marry only a particular man, Joe Schmo. I vow before God I will never take any man for a husband but Joe Schmo. Well, Joe Schmo goes off and marries somebody else. Is she stuck in this vow? No. That would be impossible. By such a vow, she would be involving another human being, which she has no right to do unless she enters into a marriage contract with that individual. All right. Fifth qualification. The vow must be in conformity with God's law. The vow must be in conformity with God's law. God will not bind any vow that conflicts with His law. For example, a vow to kill someone, like those men, the 40-plus men in Acts chapter 23, who vowed to kill the Apostle Paul. God won't honor a vow to steal something from someone else, or marriage to someone who God already considers bound to another in another vow. There are some things that simply cannot be vowed because it's not in conformity with God's law. There are some things that are unacceptable, period, to God as a vow. That is, there are some things, let's turn back to Leviticus chapter 22, that are inappropriate. There are things that are inappropriate to promise to God. Here under the sacrificial system, God gave some stipulations regarding vows and what could be vowed. Leviticus 22, verse 23, either a bull or a lamb that has any limb too long or too short, you may offer as a free will offering. But for a vow, it shall not be accepted. So there's some things God won't accept in a vow. You shall not offer to the Lord what is bruised or crushed or torn or cut, nor shall you make any offering of them in your land, nor from a foreigner's hand shall you offer any of these as the bread of your God, because their corruption is in them, and defects are in them. They shall not be accepted on your behalf. God simply will not accept some vows. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, Deuteronomy 23, verse 18. You shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the price of a dog, a sodomite, to the house of the Lord your God for any vowed offering. For both of these are an abomination to the Lord your God. And so we see from the example in Leviticus 22 as well as Deuteronomy chapter 23 that blemished or unhealthy animals would not be considered acceptable by God as vows. Neither is money gained through immoral deeds, as we read here in Deuteronomy chapter 23, allowable in a vow. There are vows, oaths, and promises made by men that are inappropriate and unacceptable to God. And as such, they are non-binding vows. Now, we have warning after warning in both the Old Testament as well as the New to be very, very careful in the use of our tongues and the verbal commitments that we make. In Proverbs 29 and verse 20. Proverbs 29:20 from the New International Translation. Do you see a man who speaks in haste? There is more hope for a fool than for him. And again, we have all kinds of Proverbs is just chock full of qualifications as far as being very careful with what we say, what we let slip from our lips. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus emphasizes here the importance of watching what comes out of our mouths. Matthew 12, verse 34, brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. But I say to you that for every idle word or injurious word that men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, by your words you will be condemned. Those who make certain vows, make certain oaths, will be condemned. In Matthew chapter 5, here as Jesus goes through and gives the instruction regarding the requirements of those who possess the Spirit of God, who are in the process of making the new covenant with God. He states, Matthew 5, verse 33, again you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. That was carnal, unconverted Israel. If you make an oath, you better perform it. But I say to you, Jesus, under the new covenant, not the covenant at Sinai, but the new covenant, I say to you, do not swear at all. Do not use an oath, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor don't use by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no. This is basically what James referred to, paraphrased, we read earlier in James chapter 5. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one. It's the evil one who's there trying to get us to swear, to make an oath, to make a promise that would be very difficult to fulfill. Well, what happens if we do make a vow and we break that vow? We don't follow through. And if the vow was made in ignorance, rashly, immaturely, or not meeting any of the other requirements of a binding vow, we haven't broken, really, that vow as God views it, because He never considered it binding from the time it was pronounced. If the qualifications of a binding vow weren't there, He doesn't consider it to even be a vow. If we have met all of the qualifications of a binding vow, God, therefore, considering it to be bound, and we break that vow, our approach should be the same as with any other sin. We have broken the third and ninth commandments if we've broken a vow that was made to God. We must repent of that sin. We must acknowledge that we have erred, seek forgiveness, and reestablish our commitment to that vow. Because God's going to hold it to us. We made it, and if we've met the qualifications of a binding vow, we are required to do it. Over the years that I've served in the ministry, I've had a number of people who've come to me various times, all broken up about breaking some promise that they considered to be a binding vow. Because that's what they called it. Oh, I made a vow to God that I wouldn't do this or that, and I've done it. In analyzing their vows, quote unquote, I have found them to be more or no more than pledges made by immature minds in total ignorance of the qualifications of a binding vow. Yet some of those same people, time and again, were trouncing all over their vows made at baptism or their marriage vows. That didn't seem to be so important, but because they vowed that they would not, give this dog away or, do some crazy thing. Now, I did it, I'm doomed to Gehenna fire because of what I did. But yet, why don't you take your baptismal vow seriously? Why don't you take your marriage vow seriously? Why are you stuck on these things? Brethren, according to God's instruction, we are to shun all situations where men consider oaths to be essential. We're to stay away from those. We have to appear as a character witness in court. Do you swear to tell the whole truth? No, I'm not going to swear. My word is, yes, I will tell the truth, but I'm not swearing for you or anybody else. Okay? That's just the way it is. So we need to stay away from those situations. Our word of promise as the children of God, as the disciples of Jesus Christ, those who have the Holy Spirit of God in us, should be undisputed and without reproach. Our vows, which should be limited to the vow at baptism and for some, the vow of marriage, should ever be before us. We should always be conscious of those vows. The fact that they must receive our total commitment. With these points in mind, let's remember to pay close heed to this proverb, chapter 13, verse 3. Proverbs 13, verse 3. Let's keep this in mind at all times. He who guards his mouth preserves his life, but, the New International goes on, he who speaks rashly will come to ruin.